Here's something nobody wants to admit, but everyone needs to hear. Your brain, that 3-pound mass of neurons you trust to show you reality, could betray you at any moment, and you'd never know the difference. We walk around assuming that what we see is what's real, that the people we recognize are who they claim to be, that our bodies exist in the space and form we perceive them to occupy. But what if I told you there are documented, medically recognized conditions where people see their hands balloon to impossible sizes, become convinced their spouse has been replaced by an identical imposter, believe everyone around them is the same person in elaborate disguises, feel certain they're already dead and rotting, or experience microscopic parasites crawling beneath their skin, and no amount of evidence, no doctors, reassurance, no logical argument can shake these convictions. This isn't science fiction or horror movie territory. This is weird psychology, and it's been woven into human experience since the beginning of recorded history, showing up in medical texts, folklore, art, and the deeply personal struggles of millions of people across cultures and centuries. The uncomfortable truth is that these bizarre phenomena, Alice in Wonderland syndrome, Capgras syndrome, Fregoli delusion, Cotard syndrome, and Ekbom syndrome, delusional parasitosis, aren't rare aberrations happening to other people in distant psychiatric wards. They're manifestations of vulnerabilities built into every human brain, dormant possibilities that can be triggered by migraines, infections, trauma, chemical imbalances, or even just the slow deterioration of aging. What makes weird psychology so profoundly unsettling isn't just the symptoms themselves, but how they expose the constructed, precarious nature of everything we take for granted about consciousness and reality. The history of these conditions reads like a detective story, where humanity slowly, painstakingly learned to recognize that the brain isn't just a passive receiver of reality, but an active constructor of it, one that can malfunction in very specific, very weird ways. Capgras syndrome was first described in 1923 by French psychiatrist Joseph Capgras, who documented a patient convinced her family members had been replaced by doubles. Fregoli delusion was identified in 1927, named after the Italian quick-change artist whose performances seemed to mirror the patient's belief that one person was appearing in multiple disguises. Cotard syndrome was described by Jules Cotard in 1880 when he encountered patients claiming to be dead or lacking internal organs. Alice in Wonderland syndrome was formally named by Dr. John Todd in 1955, though Lewis Carroll himself likely experienced these perceptual distortions based on his diary entries about bilious headaches and visual fortifications. And delusional parasitosis has been documented for over a century, with various names before Carl Axel Ekbom systematized the description in 1938. But here's what's fascinating. These weren't newly created conditions in the 19th and 20th centuries. They were newly recognized and categorized. Historical accounts suggest people throughout history experienced these phenomena, but interpreted them through the lens of their culture: demonic possession, witchcraft, divine punishment, or spiritual transformation. A medieval peasant experiencing Cotard syndrome might have believed they were cursed or damned. Someone with Capgras in ancient Rome might have thought shape-shifting demons had infiltrated their household. A Victorian experiencing Alice in Wonderland syndrome might have attributed it to laudanum or madness. The symptoms were the same, but the explanatory frameworks were radically different, showing us that weird psychology isn't just a medical phenomenon. It's a deeply human one, shaped by neurobiology, personal history, cultural context, and the stories we tell ourselves about consciousness and reality. Understanding how weird psychology operates in your personal context means recognizing the specific vulnerabilities and triggers that could, theoretically, activate these dormant possibilities in your own brain. If you're someone who experiences migraines, you have a statistically higher risk of developing Alice in Wonderland syndrome or experiencing elements of it during aura phases. That's not fear-mongering. That's neuroscience. If you have a family history of Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's, or Lewy body dementia, the odds increase that you or your loved ones might encounter Capgras syndrome, Fregoli delusion, or Cotard syndrome as the disease progresses. If you've ever used stimulants recreationally or been prescribed medications that affect dopamine, from Parkinson's treatments to ADHD medications to certain antidepressants, you've altered the same neurochemical pathways that, when dysregulated, can produce the tactile hallucinations of Ekbom syndrome or the delusional misidentifications of Fregoli and Capgras. This isn't about creating anxiety or hypochondria. It's about understanding that these conditions emerge from the same neural architecture we all share: the fusiform gyrus that recognizes faces, the parietal lobe that constructs body image, the temporal lobe that processes memory and emotion, the dopaminergic circuits that regulate perception and belief. Your personal history matters too. Significant trauma, prolonged stress, viral infections like Epstein-Barr, or even severe flu, head injuries, sleep deprivation, substance use, metabolic disorders like diabetes, or thyroid dysfunction, all of these can create the conditions where weird psychology manifests. The question isn't whether you're immune to these phenomena. Neuroscience tells us clearly that you're not. The question is whether you understand the mechanisms well enough to recognize early warning signs, seek appropriate treatment, and maybe, just maybe, develop enough humility about the nature of consciousness to realize that the line between normal perception and profound distortion is thinner than you ever imagined. Alice in Wonderland syndrome. You know, there's something truly unsettling about waking up one day and realizing that reality itself has decided to play tricks on you. That's exactly what happens to those who experience Alice in Wonderland syndrome, and honestly, it's way more terrifying than any fantasy novel could ever describe. Picture this. You're sitting in your living room, the same room you've known for years, and suddenly the ceiling stretches so high it feels like you're inside a cathedral. Or maybe your hands balloon to the size of baseball mitts right before your eyes. Sounds like something out of a fever dream, right? Well, for thousands of people around the world, this isn't fiction, it's their reality. The Alice in Wonderland syndrome doesn't care about your plans, your comfort, or your sanity. It just shows up uninvited and turns your entire perception upside down. What makes this condition so bizarre is that it's not just about seeing things differently. It's about experiencing a complete distortion of space, time, and even your own body. One moment you're fine. The next you're convinced your head has shrunk to the size of an orange, while the door across the room has grown into a towering gateway. And here's the kicker. You're fully aware that something's off, but your brain can't quite reconcile what you're seeing with what you know to be true. It's like being trapped between two realities, neither of which feels completely real. Now let's get into the nitty-gritty of what's actually happening here. Alice in Wonderland syndrome is a neurological condition that messes with your visual perception and spatial awareness in ways that would make even the most experienced neurologist scratch their head. It's named after Lewis Carroll's famous character, and for good reason. Just like Alice, who grew and shrank in Wonderland, people with this syndrome experience wild distortions in how they perceive size and distance. Medically speaking, this phenomenon is also known as Todd syndrome, named after Dr. John Todd, who first described it in 1955. What happens is that certain parts of the brain, particularly those responsible for processing visual information and body image, start firing in abnormal patterns. This creates a cascade of perceptual distortions that can affect how you see objects, how you perceive sound, and even how you experience the passage of time. Some folks report that minutes feel like hours, while others say time seems to speed up like someone hit the fast-forward button on their life. Objects might appear to be much closer or farther away than they actually are, which can make simple tasks like walking across a room feel like navigating an obstacle course in the dark. The condition is particularly common in children and teenagers, though it can strike adults too, especially those with a history of migraines. In fact, migraines are one of the most common triggers for Alice in Wonderland syndrome, along with infections, certain medications, and even stress. Let me share a real-world example that'll help you wrap your head around this. Imagine you're a 14-year-old kid sitting in math class trying to focus on geometry problems. Suddenly, without warning, your teacher's face starts to look distorted. Her nose appears to be growing, her eyes seem too far apart, and her voice sounds like it's coming from the end of a long tunnel. You blink hard, trying to reset your vision, but it doesn't help. The desk in front of you looks like it's shrinking. The classroom walls seem to be closing in, and you feel like you're Alice tumbling down the rabbit hole. This is exactly what happened to patients documented in medical literature. Teenagers who experienced multiple episodes where everyday objects would suddenly appear grotesquely large or impossibly small. The episodes would last anywhere from a few minutes to several hours, and during that time, they felt completely disconnected from reality. What's fascinating and frankly disturbing is that people experiencing Alice in Wonderland syndrome maintain full consciousness and awareness throughout these episodes. They know something is wrong, they can describe what they're experiencing, but they're powerless to stop it. It's not a hallucination in the traditional sense. The objects are really there, but the brain is processing their size, distance, and proportions in a completely warped way. Some people report that their own body parts look alien to them. Their hands might appear huge and puffy, or their legs might seem impossibly long and thin. This body image distortion, called metamorphopsia, can be deeply distressing and can trigger anxiety or even panic attacks. But here's where things get even more interesting, and this is something most people don't realize. Alice in Wonderland syndrome doesn't exist in isolation. It's often a symptom of something else going on in the brain, a warning sign, if you will. Migraines are the most common culprit in adults, affecting about 27% of reported cases, while Epstein-Barr virus infections are the leading cause in children, accounting for about 15.7% of cases. But it can also be triggered by epilepsy, brain tumors, head trauma, stroke, certain medications, or even drug use. In some cases, it's linked to conditions like Capgras syndrome, where the brain's ability to process familiar faces gets disrupted, or Fregoli delusion, delusion, where someone believes different people are actually the same person in disguise. These conditions all share something in common. They involve disruptions in how the brain processes and interprets sensory information. What's really wild is that there's no specific medical test to diagnose Alice in Wonderland syndrome. Doctors rely on patient descriptions and ruling out other conditions through MRI scans, EEGs, and neurological exams. Treatment usually focuses on addressing the underlying trigger, whether that's managing migraines with medications like triptans or beta blockers, treating infections, or adjusting medications that might be causing the symptoms. But the truth is, for many people, about 20% of cases, the episodes just come and go on their own with no identifiable cause, leaving them wondering when reality will decide to warp again. And that uncertainty, that constant fear of your perception betraying you, can be almost as distressing as the episodes themselves. It raises a deeper question about the nature of reality and trust. If your own brain can't be trusted to show you the world accurately, what else might be lurking beneath the surface, waiting to reveal itself when you least expect it? Capgras syndrome. If you think Alice in Wonderland syndrome messes with your head, wait until you hear about Capgras syndrome, a condition so unsettling it makes you question the very foundation of human relationships and trust. Imagine looking into the eyes of someone you've loved for decades, your spouse, your mother, your best friend, and feeling absolutely certain with every fiber of your being that this person is an imposter. Not just a stranger pretending to be them, but an exact replica, a duplicate so perfect that everyone else is fooled, but you know better. That's Capgras syndrome, and it's one of the most heartbreaking psychological phenomena you'll ever encounter. What makes this condition particularly cruel is that the person experiencing it isn't just paranoid or confused. Their brain is literally disconnected from their emotional response to familiar faces. They can recognize the face, they know who it's supposed to be, but that warm feeling of familiarity, that emotional connection that says, "This is my loved one," is completely absent. It's like looking at a perfectly crafted wax figure instead of a living, breathing human being. And no amount of reasoning, no stack of photo albums or shared memories can convince them otherwise. The person with Capgras syndrome will look you dead in the eye and tell you with complete conviction that you're not who you claim to be. You're just wearing their face. Let's dig deeper into what's happening inside the brain when Capgras syndrome takes hold. The prevailing theory among neuroscientists is that there's a disconnect between two crucial brain regions, the temporal cortex, which handles facial recognition, and the limbic system, particularly the amygdala, which processes emotions and creates that feeling of familiarity. Think of it like this. Your brain has two separate departments working on recognizing people. Department A, the temporal cortex, looks at a face and says, "Yep, that's Mom, I recognize those features." But Department B, the amygdala, is supposed to chime in with, "And I feel love and warmth when I see her." In Capgras syndrome, Department A is working fine, but Department B is silent. The result? You recognize the face intellectually, but emotionally it feels wrong, foreign, fake. Neurologist V.S. Ramachandran famously demonstrated this disconnect through experiments showing that people with Capgras syndrome don't show the normal emotional skin conductance response when seeing familiar faces, even though they can identify them correctly. This condition most commonly develops in people with neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's, Lewy body dementia, or Parkinson's disease, but it can also result from traumatic brain injury, stroke, epilepsy, or even schizophrenia. Interestingly, Capgras syndrome occurs about 50% more frequently in women than in men, though researchers aren't entirely sure why. Some studies have even linked it to metabolic conditions like hypothyroidism, vitamin B12 deficiency, and substance abuse involving cannabis or cocaine. Now here's where things get really dark and disturbing, and this is something that connects back to our earlier discussion about Alice in Wonderland syndrome and forward to what we'll explore with Fragoli delusion. The person identified as the imposter is usually someone incredibly close to the patient, often the primary caregiver, a spouse, adult child, or parent who's already under immense stress trying to care for someone with dementia or mental illness. Can you imagine the emotional devastation? You've dedicated yourself to caring for your aging mother, and suddenly she looks at you with suspicion and fear, insisting you're not her real daughter, that you're some kind of body snatcher trying to fool her. Studies show that caregivers identified as imposters experience severe anxiety, depression, isolation, and sleep disturbances. The syndrome can manifest suddenly, with the patient's entire behavior changing when dealing with the supposed imposter. They might refuse to speak in their presence, show fear or aggression, or become agitated and accusatory. In some documented cases, patients have reported that there might be multiple imposters, with different versions of the same person appearing at different times, which overlaps conceptually with Fragoli delusion, where one person is believed to be disguised as multiple different individuals. There's also a persistent myth that Capgras syndrome makes people inherently violent, but research shows this is rare. When violence does occur, it's usually related to an underlying condition like schizophrenia rather than the Capgras delusion itself. What's absolutely fascinating and honestly terrifying about Capgras syndrome is how it reveals the fragile nature of our sense of reality and connection. Recent research has shown that the condition often involves damage or dysfunction in multiple brain regions, not just the temporal limbic disconnect. Right hemisphere hypofunction, altered connectivity between cortical association areas and limbic structures, deficits in facial processing, and dysfunction in working memory have all been implicated. In first episode Psychotic Disorders, Capgras phenomenon has been associated with particularly unique symptoms: olfactory hallucinations, smelling things that aren't there; somatosensory hallucinations, feeling sensations on or under the skin, much like what happens in Ekbom syndrome or delusional parasitosis; Schneiderian delusional perceptions, and what's called cycloid features, including rapidly shifting psychomotor and affective symptoms, extreme anxiety, over-concern with death, and profound perplexity. There's even been documented cases where Capgras delusions focus not on people but on objects, someone believing their belongings have been replaced with identical replicas, which researchers believe results from dysfunction in visual association areas combined with frontal lobe executive dysfunction. Treatment typically involves managing the underlying condition, whether that's adjusting medications for schizophrenia, treating the progression of dementia, or addressing metabolic issues like thyroid problems or B12 deficiency. But here's the unsettling truth: there's no cure, no magic pill that instantly restores that emotional connection. For many people and their families, it's about learning to navigate a reality where the person they love no longer recognizes them as real, where every interaction is colored by suspicion and fear. And that raises an even more disturbing question. If our sense of who people are can be so fundamentally altered by a neurological glitch, what does that say about the nature of identity, recognition, and love itself? Could there be other ways our brain might deceive us about the people around us? Fragoli delusion. So you've just learned about Capgras syndrome, where someone believes their loved ones have been replaced by identical imposters. Now let's flip that nightmare on its head and talk about Fragoli delusion, a condition where the brain plays the opposite trick, convincing someone that different people they encounter are actually the same familiar person wearing elaborate disguises. Yeah, you read that right. Imagine walking down the street and becoming absolutely convinced that the barista at your coffee shop, the mailman, your boss, and the stranger sitting next to you on the bus are all the same person. Maybe your neighbor, maybe your ex, maybe someone you barely know, just constantly changing their appearance to follow and watch you. The paranoia is off the charts because you're not just dealing with one imposter, you're dealing with what feels like an entire conspiracy where one person has somehow mastered the art of disguise to stalk you through every moment of your day. Named after Leopoldo Fragoli, an Italian actor famous in the early 1900s for his lightning-fast costume changes and ability to play multiple characters in a single performance, this delusion captures that same sense of theatrical transformation, except in the sufferer's mind, it's happening everywhere, all the time. What's particularly haunting about Fragoli delusion is how it combines elements we've already seen in both Alice in Wonderland syndrome and Capgras syndrome. The visual processing goes haywire like in Alice in Wonderland syndrome, but instead of objects changing size, it's faces that seem to morph and transform. And like Capgras syndrome, there's a profound disconnect between what the person sees and what they emotionally feel is true. Let's break down the neuroscience behind this bizarre phenomenon, because understanding what's happening in the brain makes it both more fascinating and more terrifying. Fragoli delusion is classified as one of the delusional misidentification syndromes, DMS, a family of disorders that includes Capgras syndrome, and which we'll see again when we talk about Cotard syndrome. Research suggests that Fragoli delusion involves dysfunction in several brain regions responsible for facial recognition, emotional processing, and reality testing. Specifically, there's evidence of damage or abnormalities in the fusiform gyrus, which handles face recognition, the right hemisphere, which processes holistic visual information, and the frontal lobes, which manage executive functions like reasoning and reality checking. But here's where it gets really interesting. One of the leading pharmaceutical causes of Fragoli delusion is levodopa, also known as L-dopa, which is the precursor to dopamine and commonly prescribed to treat Parkinson's disease and dopamine-responsive dystonia. Clinical studies have shown that prolonged use of levodopa can lead to visual hallucinations and delusions, and in most patients, the delusions become so salient that they occupy almost all of the patient's attention. When levodopa concentration decreases, the number of reported delusions decreases as well, strongly suggesting a direct neurochemical link. The condition can also be triggered by traumatic brain injury, dementia, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, substance abuse, particularly stimulants like amphetamines or hallucinogens, and severe emotional trauma or stress. Now here's a real-world real-world scenario that'll help you understand just how debilitating and frightening Fragoli delusion can be for those who experience it. Picture Sarah, a 52-year-old woman with early-stage Parkinson's disease who's been on levodopa therapy for about 2 years. One afternoon, she goes to the grocery store and sees a woman in the produce section who looks vaguely familiar. Maybe she has similar hair color to Sarah's sister-in-law or wears glasses with a similar frame. Suddenly, Sarah becomes convinced that this stranger is her sister-in-law in disguise, watching her, following her. She leaves the store quickly, heart pounding, convinced she's being surveilled. Over the next few weeks, the delusion intensifies and spreads. The postal worker is her sister-in-law. The woman at the pharmacy is her sister-in-law. Even a man she passes on the street somehow becomes her sister-in-law in elaborate male disguise. The paranoia becomes all-consuming. Why is she being followed? What does this person want? Is she in danger? Sarah experiences heightened anxiety, fear, and social withdrawal because she can't trust anyone around her. This is not an uncommon presentation of Fragoli delusion. Patients often exhibit paranoia, believing that the perceived person is intent on causing them harm. They may experience visual or auditory hallucinations that reinforce their delusional beliefs. The emotional distress affects personal and professional relationships, leading to isolation and deteriorating quality of life. What connects this to our earlier discussions is the visual memory deficit and deficit in self-monitoring and self-awareness that patients display, similar to the perceptual distortions in Alice in Wonderland syndrome and the emotional disconnection in Capgras syndrome. Treatment for Fragoli delusion follows a similar path to other delusional misidentification syndromes, though outcomes vary widely depending on the underlying cause and the patient's overall neurological health. Antipsychotic medications are the frontrunners in treatment, with atypical antipsychotics like risperidone and olanzapine commonly prescribed to alleviate delusional beliefs and associated symptoms. In addition to antipsychotics, anticonvulsants and antidepressants are also prescribed in some treatment courses to combat anxiety, paranoia, and other symptoms. Cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, can help patients challenge and reframe their distorted beliefs, learning coping strategies to manage the intense anxiety and distress. Supportive psychotherapy provides a safe space for patients to express their fears and concerns, aiming to enhance emotional resilience and improve social functioning. Family therapy is also beneficial, educating family members about the disorder and equipping them with strategies to support the patient without feeling insulted or hurt by the accusations and paranoid beliefs. Here's something crucial to understand. Habilitation therapy, a form of treatment where the patient is not repeatedly contradicted and corrected, can be more beneficial than constantly trying to convince them their perceptions are wrong. The prognosis varies widely. In some case studies, patients recovered slowly over time, while in others, especially elderly patients, the delusions continued or became worse, progressing into general dementia. What's particularly unsettling is how Fragoli delusion reveals the brain's fragile hold on identity recognition and reality testing. And if you think believing everyone around you is the same person in disguise is disturbing, wait until you hear about a condition where the delusion isn't about who other people are, but about your own existence, or rather your supposed lack of it. Cotard syndrome. Alright, let's talk about something that'll genuinely shake your understanding of consciousness and existence. If Capgras syndrome makes you believe your loved ones are imposters, and Fragoli delusion convinces you everyone is the same person in disguise, then Cotard syndrome takes the psychological horror to its absolute darkest depth. It makes you believe you're dead. That's right, not dying, not sick beyond recovery, but literally already dead, a walking corpse wandering through a world you no longer belong to. Imagine waking up one morning and feeling with absolute certainty that your heart isn't beating, your blood isn't flowing, your organs have rotted away, or that you died days ago and what remains is just an empty shell going through the motions. Some people with Cotard syndrome, also known as walking corpse syndrome, believe they're immortal. Not in a good way, but in the sense that they're already dead and therefore can't die again, trapped in an eternal limbo between life and death. Others deny the existence of specific body parts, insisting their brain has dissolved, their intestines have disappeared, or their blood has stopped circulating entirely. This isn't metaphorical depression or feeling emotionally dead. These are concrete, unshakable delusions that distort the person's entire sense of self and reality. What makes Cotard syndrome particularly devastating is that it often comes packaged with severe depression, anxiety, and nihilism, a belief that nothing has value or meaning, which makes perfect sense if you genuinely believe you're a corpse. And here's something that connects directly to what we've discussed. Cotard syndrome shares neurological pathways with both Capgras syndrome and the perceptual distortions we saw in Alice in Wonderland syndrome. The neuroscience behind Cotard syndrome is absolutely fascinating and reveals just how interconnected these weird psychological phenomena really are. Research suggests suggests that Cotard syndrome develops from a neural disconnection similar to what happens in Capgras syndrome, except instead of the disconnection occurring when looking at other people's faces, it happens when patients see their own face or contemplate their own existence. The fusiform face area and other regions involved in facial recognition remain intact, so the person can recognize their reflection. But the emotional connection, that visceral sense of "this is me, I exist, I'm alive," is completely severed. This creates a profound sense of derealization, a disconnection from reality and from one's own body. Neuroimaging studies have found that people with Cotard syndrome show brain atrophy, especially in the median frontal lobe, and lesions in the parietal lobe more frequently than control groups. Specifically, studies of 12 patients with Cotard syndrome found that 4 had changes to the frontal lobe, 4 had generalized loss in brain volume, 5 showed decreased blood flow in certain brain areas, and 7 had lesions on at least one side of the brain. The condition typically progresses through 3 distinct stages: the germination stage, characterized by hypochondriasis, senesthopathy, abnormal bodily sensations, and depressed mood; the blooming stage, where full nihilistic delusions develop, along with anxiety and negative thoughts; and the chronic stage, which can take either a depressive form with persistent emotional disorders or a paranoid form where depressive symptoms become less prominent. Cotard syndrome is most commonly seen in patients with severe psychotic depression, but it's also associated with schizophrenia, dementia, epilepsy, migraine, multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's disease, stroke, traumatic brain injury, brain tumors, and even certain infections affecting the brain. Let me paint you a picture of what living with Cotard syndrome actually looks like, because the clinical descriptions don't capture the absolute horror of this condition. There's a documented case of a 65-year-old retired teacher, Mr. B, who had no prior mental health history but developed Cotard syndrome after significant psychosocial stresses. His symptoms started gradually over a year and a half with sadness, poor socialization, anhedonia, inability to feel pleasure, anxiety, decreased sleep and appetite, and overwhelming ideas of worthlessness, hopelessness, sin, and guilt. But then the delusions bloomed. He became convinced that his body was rotting from the inside, that his organs had ceased functioning, and that he was essentially a dead man still moving around. Another case involved a female patient who became emaciated, dehydrated, and developed bilateral pitting edema because she believed eating and drinking were pointless. Why would a dead person need food? Her mental state examination revealed sad affect, mutism, rigidity in all 4 limbs, and negativism. This self-starvation is terrifyingly common in Cotard syndrome because if you genuinely believe you're dead or that your digestive system has disappeared, consuming food seems absurd or impossible. Patients often become less sociable, withdrawing completely from the world because social interaction feels meaningless when you're convinced you don't exist. Some experience delusions of immortality alongside their belief in being dead. They think they're trapped in an undead state, unable to truly die, which paradoxically can lead to suicide attempts as they desperately try to escape their perceived non-existence. The condition dramatically increases risk for self-harm, self-starvation, and completed suicide, making early recognition absolutely critical, especially in emergency department settings. What's particularly disturbing is how this connects to the other conditions we've explored, like the perceptual unreality of Alice in Wonderland syndrome, the emotional disconnection of Capgras syndrome, and the identity confusion of Fragoli delusion. Cotard syndrome reveals how fragile our sense of being alive and existing truly is. Treatment for Cotard syndrome requires an aggressive, multifaceted approach because of the severe risk to the patient's life. Factor analysis of 100 cases identified 3 distinct subtypes: psychotic depression, patients with melancholia and nihilistic delusions; Cotard type 1, pure nihilistic delusions without effective symptoms; and Cotard type 2, mixed symptoms, including anxiety, depression, and auditory hallucinations. Treatment typically involves a combination of antidepressants, antipsychotics, and mood stabilizers tailored to the specific subtype and underlying condition. Electroconvulsive therapy, ECT, has shown remarkable effectiveness in severe cases, particularly those involving treatment-resistant depression with Cotard delusions. In terms of neurobiological evidence, many studies suggest a lack of gross abnormalities on standard neuroimaging, but detailed studies that have found changes point to involvement of frontotemporal-parietal circuitry in the pathophysiology. Neurophysiological studies suggest that patients with Cotard syndrome show a lack of differential autonomic response to stimuli and a reduction in affective response. Essentially, their bodies stop reacting emotionally to anything, which reinforces their belief that they're no longer alive. Personality factors also play a role. Studies suggest that patients with a more internal attributional style, those who tend to blame themselves for negative events, are more prone to developing Cotard syndrome. Cultural factors may shape how the psychopathology neurology manifests, with the specific content of delusions varying across different cultural contexts. Interestingly, some cases of Cotard syndrome have been triggered by adverse reactions to medications, particularly acyclovir and its prodrug valacyclovir, where high serum concentrations of the metabolite CMMG were associated with syndrome symptoms. The prognosis varies dramatically. Some patients recover with appropriate treatment, while others, particularly elderly patients with underlying dementia, may experience worsening symptoms or progression into general cognitive decline. What's perhaps most unsettling about Cotard syndrome is how it exposes the fundamental relationship between brain chemistry, emotional processing, and our most basic sense of being alive. But if you think believing you're dead is as bizarre as psychological phenomena get, there's one more condition we need to discuss. One where the delusion isn't about existence or identity, but about something crawling, multiplying, and infesting your body from within. Ekbom syndrome. Delusional parasitosis. We've journeyed through perceptual distortions where rooms grow and shrink, through the nightmare of believing your loved ones are imposters, through the paranoia of thinking everyone is the same person in disguise, and through the existential horror of believing you're already dead. Now we arrive at perhaps the most viscerally disturbing condition of all, Ekbom syndrome, also known as delusional parasitosis, AEE, psychological disorder, where people become absolutely convinced that their bodies are infested with parasites, insects, worms, or other organisms crawling under their skin, despite absolutely no medical evidence whatsoever. If you've ever felt a phantom itch after hearing about bed bugs or lice, you have a tiny glimpse of what people with Ekbom syndrome experience constantly, except magnified 1,000 times with unwavering conviction that it's real. They feel things crawling, burrowing, biting, and moving beneath their skin, sensations so vivid and compelling that no amount of dermatological examination, negative lab tests, or reassurance from doctors can convince them otherwise. Patients often present to dermatologists with what's called the matchbox sign, bringing in plastic bags, jars, or matchboxes filled with skin scrapings, lint, dried skin, or debris that they're convinced are the parasites or their eggs, desperate for validation and treatment. The condition is named after Swedish neurologist Carl Axel Ekbom, who first described it in 1938, though it's also sometimes called delusional infestation or Morgellons disease when patients believe they're infested with fibers or filaments. What makes this particularly tragic is how it intersects with the other conditions we've discussed, like Alice in Wonderland syndrome. There's a profound distortion in sensory perception. Like Capgras and Fregoli, there's an unshakable false belief that persists despite contradictory evidence. And like Cotard syndrome, which we saw causes people to believe parts of their body have ceased to exist, Ekbom syndrome creates an equally disturbing but opposite delusion that foreign entities are very much alive and active inside the body. The neurobiology and psychology of Ekbom syndrome reveal fascinating connections to dopamine dysregulation and tactile hallucinations that help us understand why this delusion is so persistent and distressing. Delusional parasitosis is classified as a monosymptomatic hypochondriacal psychosis, meaning it's a singular, focused delusion about bodily infestation without broader psychotic symptoms like schizophrenia might produce. Research suggests that the condition involves dysfunction in the brain's dopaminergic pathways, which are the same pathways implicated in other delusional disorders and psychotic conditions. This is why stimulant drugs like cocaine, amphetamines, and methamphetamine, which massively increase dopamine levels, can trigger what's called cocaine bugs or meth mites, where users become convinced insects are crawling under their skin and will scratch and pick at themselves compulsively, creating open sores and infections. The tactile hallucinations in Ekbom syndrome are called formication, from the Latin word formica, meaning ant, describing that crawling, creeping sensation. But unlike drug-induced formication, which typically resolves when the substance leaves the system, primary delusional parasitosis persists chronically. The condition can be primary, arising on its own without other psychiatric or medical conditions, secondary to psychiatric disorders like schizophrenia, depression, bipolar disorder, or dementia, or secondary to medical conditions like diabetes, vitamin B12 deficiency, hypothyroidism, kidney failure, liver disease, or neurological disorders. What's particularly interesting is the overlap with conditions we've already discussed. Patients with Fregoli delusion sometimes experience somatic hallucinations, including formication and the olfactory and somatosensory. Hallucinations we saw associated with Capgras syndrome in first episode Psychosis share the same neural substrates as Ekbom syndrome. Let me walk you through what living with Ekbom syndrome actually looks like, because the human cost of this condition is absolutely devastating. Imagine Margaret, a 58-year-old retired accountant with no history of mental illness or substance abuse. It starts innocuously, maybe a fleeting itch, a sensation sensation that feels like something moving across her arm. At first she dismisses it, but the sensations persist and intensify. Within weeks, she's convinced that microscopic parasites have invaded her skin. She feels them constantly, crawling across her scalp, burrowing into her arms, moving beneath the skin of her face and neck. She sees what she interprets as evidence: tiny black specks on her sheets, small bumps on her skin, filaments emerging from pores. She begins the desperate cycle that defines Ekbom syndrome, visiting dermatologist after dermatologist, bringing Ziploc bags filled with skin scrapings and lint, demanding they examine the parasites under a microscope. When lab tests come back negative, no mites, no lice, no parasites of any kind, she doesn't accept it. She becomes convinced that the doctors are incompetent, that the parasites are too sophisticated to show up in standard tests, or that there's a massive medical conspiracy to dismiss her suffering. She starts treating herself, bathing in bleach solutions, applying pesticides to her skin, scrubbing herself raw with abrasive materials, even using veterinary anti-parasitic medications meant for livestock. Her skin becomes damaged from the constant scratching, picking, and chemical applications, open sores, scars, infections, which she interprets as further evidence of infestation rather than self-inflicted wounds. She isolates herself socially because she's terrified of spreading the infestation to others, or because she's convinced people can see the parasites and are repulsed. Her quality of life plummets. She can't sleep because she feels them moving at night. She can't focus on anything except the constant sensation and the compulsive need to extract them. Relationships deteriorate because loved ones don't believe her, and doctors keep telling her it's psychiatric rather than dermatological. This is the lived reality of Ekbom syndrome, and it shares the same desperate, reality-distorting quality we've seen across all these weird psychological phenomena, from the perceptual chaos of Alice in Wonderland syndrome, to the identity confusion of Capgras and Fregoli, to the existential void of Cotard syndrome. Treatment for Ekbom syndrome is challenging, precisely because patients don't believe their condition is psychological. They're seeking dermatological or parasitological solutions, not psychiatric help. The most effective treatment approach involves antipsychotic medications, particularly pimozide, a typical antipsychotic that was considered the gold standard for decades, and newer atypical antipsychotics like risperidone, olanzapine, and aripiprazole, which work by blocking dopamine receptors and reducing the intensity of tactile hallucinations and delusional thinking. Response rates to antipsychotics are relatively high. Some studies show 60–100% of patients experience significant improvement or complete remission when they actually take the medication consistently. However, getting patients to accept psychiatric treatment is the biggest challenge, because acknowledging the condition as delusional means accepting that the parasites they feel with absolute certainty aren't real, which creates profound cognitive dissonance. Dermatologists have developed a strategy called the therapeutic alliance approach, where instead of bluntly telling patients there are no parasites, you need a psychiatrist, they acknowledge the very real suffering and sensations the patient is experiencing, validate that the symptoms are causing genuine distress, and frame antipsychotic medication not as "you're crazy," but as "this medication helps with nerve sensations and can reduce the crawling feelings you're experiencing." Cognitive behavioral therapy can help patients develop coping strategies and challenge their delusional beliefs, though this is only effective once they're willing to engage with psychological treatment. When Ekbom syndrome is secondary to another condition, diabetes, thyroid dysfunction, B12 deficiency, dementia, or substance abuse, treating the underlying cause can resolve the delusional parasitosis. What's absolutely crucial to understand is how these 5 conditions we've explored, Alice in Wonderland syndrome, Capgras syndrome, Fregoli delusion, Cotard syndrome, and Ekbom syndrome, all reveal the same fundamental truth about human consciousness and perception, our sense of reality, our recognition of ourselves and others, our understanding of our own bodies, and our conviction about what's real versus what's delusion, are all constructed by fragile, fallible neural processes that can be disrupted by infections, brain damage, chemical imbalances, or psychological trauma. These weird psychological phenomena aren't just medical curiosities, they're windows into the machinery of consciousness itself, showing us that the boundary between sanity and madness, between accurate perception and total distortion, is thinner and more permeable than any of us would like to believe. So now you've seen it all. 5 of the most bizarre, reality-shattering psychological phenomena that prove your brain is both the most sophisticated machine in the known universe and the most vulnerable one. You've learned about Alice in Wonderland syndrome warping your perception of size and space, Capgras syndrome destroying your emotional connection to loved ones, Fregoli delusion making you see the same person everywhere in disguise, Cotard syndrome convincing you you're dead, and Ekbom syndrome creating infestations that exist only in neural firing patterns. But here's the critical question. What are you going to do with this knowledge? Are you going to file it away as interesting trivia about crazy people, or are you going to recognize that understanding weird psychology gives you actual power? Power to recognize early warning signs in yourself or loved ones. Power to respond with empathy instead of dismissal when someone's reality starts fragmenting. Power to seek help before a treatable neurological symptom becomes a life-destroying delusion. Think about it. If someone you love starts saying their spouse has been replaced, or that parasites are crawling under their skin, or that they're already dead, would you know that these are medical conditions with real treatments like antipsychotics, antidepressants, ECT, and therapy combinations that have 60–100% success rates when properly applied? Or would you write them off as losing their mind and miss the narrow window where intervention could save their relationships, their quality of life, maybe even their life itself? Here's what I want you to consider, and really sit with this. Every single one of these conditions reveals something profound about the architecture of human consciousness. Alice in Wonderland syndrome shows us that spatial perception and body image are constructed illusions your brain maintains through constant effort. Capgras and Fragoli prove that facial recognition and emotional familiarity are separate systems that can disconnect. Cotard syndrome demonstrates that your sense of being alive is an active neurological process, not a given. And Ekbom syndrome reveals that the boundary between perception and hallucination is thinner than you'd ever want to believe. What does that mean for you personally? It means the reality you're experiencing right now, your certainty about who you are, who other people are, whether you exist, whether your body is intact, is maintained by fragile neural networks that could, theoretically, be disrupted tomorrow by a virus, a head injury, a medication, interaction, a stroke, or just the slow accumulation of cellular damage we call aging. That's not meant to terrify you. It's meant to cultivate humility about consciousness and compassion for those whose neural machinery has malfunctioned. When you understand that these aren't character flaws or weakness, but neurological disorders as real as diabetes or epilepsy, you start approaching mental health with the seriousness it deserves. So here's my challenge to you, and I mean this seriously. Have you ever experienced moments where reality felt slightly off, where sizes seemed wrong, where a familiar person felt emotionally distant for no reason, where you questioned your own existence in a way that went beyond normal existential anxiety, where you felt phantom sensations you couldn't explain? If so, don't dismiss those experiences as nothing, but also don't catastrophize them into full-blown syndromes. Understand the difference between passing oddities and persistent delusions. Are you currently on medications for migraines, Parkinson's, depression, ADHD, anything that affects brain chemistry? Have you thought about how those substances are altering the same dopaminergic and serotonergic pathways implicated in these weird psychological phenomena? If someone close to you, a parent aging with dementia, a friend with schizophrenia, a sibling with severe depression, starts exhibiting signs of delusional misidentification or perceptual distortion, are you prepared to recognize it and get them help instead of arguing with them about what's real? And here's the biggest question of all. Are you ready to accept that the nature of reality, identity, and consciousness is far more fragile, constructed, and subjective than our everyday experience suggests? And that this knowledge should make you more curious, more compassionate, and more committed to understanding how the human brain works and how it fails. If any of this resonated with you, if you found yourself thinking, I need to learn more about this, then don't let that impulse fade. Subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell, because we're going to keep diving deep into the strange, unsettling, and absolutely fascinating world of psychology, neuroscience, and human behavior. There are dozens more psychological phenomena we haven't even touched. Capgras for objects, reduplicative paramnesia, where you believe locations have been duplicated, autoscopy, where you see your own doppelganger, somatoparaphrenia, where you deny ownership of your own limbs. The human brain is endlessly weird, endlessly vulnerable, and endlessly worth understanding. Drop a comment below. Have you or someone you know experienced any of these conditions? What aspect of weird psychology do you want us to explore next? Let's build a community that takes mental health seriously, that understands neuroscience isn't just abstract theory, but lived experience for millions, and that recognizes the line between normal and pathological is drawn in brain chemistry, not moral character. Hit subscribe, activate those notifications, and let's keep peeling back the layers of what makes us human, the beautiful parts and the terrifying parts alike.